The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, welcome everyone. This is David Aguayo from the University of Missouri, and I have the pleasure of having Dr. Candace Kubi here next to me. We're actually sharing a university. We're in the same department, the College of Education. Actually, same college, different departments. I want to really quickly introduce this webinar. This is our second webinar of a three-series part. And the webinar series is regarding social justice methodologies in education. And so the first one we had was in July, and we had the pleasure of having Dr. Michelle Young and discussing with us how to get started, what to do to begin thinking about social justice methodologies, especially as graduate students or early career folks in academia. This time around, for our second part of the series, Dr. Candace Kubi, my professor, my mentor, thank you so much for being here. She is talking to us a little bit about how do we actually begin disrupting, breaking down some of these traditional ways of doing research, and she'll be basing her conversation and discussion based on a book that she co-edited with Dr. Brown, Dr. Carducci, and herself. And it's a book that I came across taking one of her classes, post-structural methodologies in qualitative research, and I found the book really extremely helpful. I'm not trying to push the book necessarily, but it's a good guide to thinking about doing research, qualitative research, differently from what's traditionally known. And from this class, from this book particularly, my dissertation and my methodology in my dissertation focuses on non-traditional qualitative, and she'll be talking about the different terminologies, so on and so forth. I want to welcome you, Dr. Kubi.
Thank you, David.
Before I begin, quick logistics. You'll be able to answer or to have ask any questions throughout the presentation. Please feel free to either ask a question under the question mark on your panel, control panel, if you all see it to your right hand side. Also, we also have under attendees, you can feel free to, if you have a question, to mark that you have a question, and you can speak the question out loud to us. And if you raise your hand on this panel under attendees, you'll be able to, I'll be able to see that you have a question, and I'll be able to highlight it so you can ask it in front of all of us here. Also, there's a handout. The handout is there as the introduction of the book, and so if you this for your taking, so also as a way to follow along the conversation. So without further ado, Dr. Candace Kubi.
Thank you, David.
Next.
There we go. All right. So I want to just thank David and the organization for inviting me today to chat with you all. Like David said, I plan to talk from this book. This is the cover of the book. And I also want to acknowledge that it was co-edited with Ruth Nicole and Rosanna. So it's not that, this presentation is all about my thinking, but about our collaborative thinking as we edited the book together. So this is the opening quote in the introduction of the book, and if you have the handout that David mentioned, you're welcome to download it and follow along. But I'm going to pause for a second so that we can read this, and then I'll move into our thinking around disruptive methodologies. So Ruth Nicole writes, "The best method to use is the one that answers the research question. I was taught this as a graduate student, and now as a professor, I teach the same lesson to my students. It succinctly ends unproductive conversations about shopping for methods like one does for clothes. Should I go with what is trendy, designer, secondhand, clearance? Which method will cost me less? Time, stress, coursework, my students ask. Others seem to only want to improve on strategies they already know, are unwilling to learn new ways, take critique, and or allow themselves to be open to surprise. Sometimes methods are like people are stereotyped as threatening, and even if it is the best method for the question, they resist. because of what they've heard about qualitative or quantitative project. Fear looms large, and it shows up in unexpected ways, even in conversations about methods. So we were inspired to co-edit this book, one that we envisioned would be used alongside more traditional introductory qual books. We really wanted a textbook that would go beyond what we call the Creswell Five, which is case study, ethnography, grounded theory, narrative, and phenomenology. And as editors, we began the book with a strategic disruption. We asked readers to think back to the time before you found yourself entrenched in graduate student or in departmental politics, where you felt constrained by the norms of academic dress and vocabulary and weighted down with the formal and informal advice of colleagues. We want readers to remember the research questions and educational issues that captured your mind and heart before you were told, while it sounds promising, it's better to wait to do that project until you get a tenure track job and have tenure. It is those questions and issues that we wanted readers to think about, the unmentionable projects that you cannot let go of, even as they lay buried underneath the scripted elevator that you have prepared about who you are and what study that you would like to focus on. So we start the book by just trying to disrupt kind of that regularly scheduled program of what qualitative research should look like, specifically for graduate students, where they are enmeshed in the politics of inquiry at their university, with their committee, with their advisor. And we're trying to disrupt that with the book. And so in the introduction of the book, we try to outline the rationale for why we think it's time to disrupt qualitative inquiry. And you can see here on the screen some of the scholarship and authors that we drew upon to make that case. We talk a little bit about the National Research Council and the report that they put out in 2002, which has dominated educational scholarship over the last 10 or more years now. Also, we talk about methodological conservatism, which really prizes or values large-scale random sample quasi-experimental designs as the gold standard. And also, with that notion of methodological conservatism, there is an effort to discredit or to not value perhaps more marginalized approaches for knowledge production. So our belief as editors is that disruptive research practices are needed and necessary in order to better understand and address the complex contemporary global, historical, political, economic, and social context and relationships that undermine the achievement of equitable educational access and outcomes. We asked what is left out of or what is missing in educational research that's dominated by post-positivist and constructivist research norms. While researchers use critical, post-structural, and feminist frames and studies, critical methodological approaches and methods that disrupt the assumptions and traditions of these perspectives still remain marginalized. So in the book's introduction, we conceptualized 5 ways that we believe researchers can disrupt more traditional dominant methodologies. And I will pause to say that the word disrupt was intentional. We wanted in the title of the book for the word to be an action, a verb, something that we're always continually doing. And so we chose the word disrupting, but when I teach courses where this book is used, we often talk about what does disruptive mean, what does non-dominant mean, or non-traditional or contemporary, and how non-dominant traditional contemporary methodologies are different based on the context and the field and the discipline that you are a part of. And so it's not a static definition. And so these 5 ways of disrupting that we listed in the introduction, we don't see as the only 5. In fact, we encouraged our readers to think of more and how these might change over time. And so you can see here that we talk about ways of disrupting dominant notions of research roles and relationships. So thinking about how we relate to the communities that we work with, or the participants that are a part of our study, how we negotiate and recognize power differentials and the ways of being transparent as researchers. The second one, disrupting dominant approaches to the collection and analysis of data. So encouraging researchers to seek alternative ways of collecting and producing data as well as analyzing it. The third one, encouraging researchers to disrupt dominant notions of representation and how we go about disseminating research findings. And so thinking about how we represent, where we choose to represent, speaks to our beliefs as researchers. So thinking maybe beyond research journals, how do we disseminate findings with the communities that we work with and honor their stories and their work as co-researchers or co-collaborators. The fourth one, disrupting rigid epistemological and methodological boundaries. We encouraged authors in the book to think about or experiment with perhaps new theories that weren't dominant in their particular fields, and thinking about theories as malleable, and encourage them to think about ways of reading theories against or with one another and what newness that might produce. And the fifth one, to disrupt disciplinary boundaries and assumptive frameworks of how to do research. And so really interrogating how knowledge is produced and how it is organized, and challenging rigid and unproductive boundaries between disciplines. And so we also asked our authors that contributed to the book to think about the politics of doing this work. When you're thinking about disrupting a particular approach to research or the content or the way you go about doing research, there are possible negative and there's also productive consequences, I think, to that disrupting. And so we wanted to be transparent in the book to talk about the politics of doing this work. Many of the authors in the book talked about these tensions, but also were very joyful and hopeful in the projects that they were invested in. So in the book, we've asked the authors to talk about what we consider 3 levels of disrupting. One, we talk about the macro level. And we think about this more as the global movement of methodological conservatism, thinking about capitalism and neoliberalism in the academy at large, and how these forces, these areas do influence how we think about doing research. The second is the meso level, and we conceptualize this thinking about organizational or institutional efforts. So for myself here at the University of Missouri, thinking about how the particular peer review process for grant funding, internal grants or external grants, as well as publications, the institutional review board and how that operates, and also tenure and promotion practices. And again, that's going to be specific to particular institutions in the way they view tenure and promotion, and how that influences the kinds of research or activities that someone would choose to invest their time in. And finally, we also asked authors to think about the micro level, and so thinking about the self in relation to the politics of inquiry and the disruptive approaches that they might invest their time in. And so thinking about the daily practices of inquiry, research relationships with particular participants or co-researchers, thinking about the threat of censure, so perhaps from colleagues in your department, from peers, mentors in your department, as well as thinking about how we, drawing on Foucault, how we might police ourselves and what we allow ourselves or choose to engage in or not engage in.
We have a question, Dr. Kubi, about neoliberalism. Would you mind clarifying that?
Yeah, so when I think about neoliberalism, I think about thinking about the way capitalism and the efforts around accountability that have seeped into, in my case, we're thinking of higher education. And so thinking about how funding for grants is at my institution pushed really strongly. And I think about public institutions that we might argue are not so public anymore when, you know, a large percentage of the funding for that institution doesn't come from public dollars, but maybe from grants from private donations. And so there's an effort there for faculty members to seek external funds and money. Also, there's efforts to turn your research into something that could be marketable, something that can be patented, something that can be put in the market, so to speak, that would earn money or prestige for the institution. So I think about also the metrics that get used to determine if you are a successful or valuable faculty member. And so there's certain types of journals with higher impact factors. And so all of these different accountability and numeric ways of determining value and worth, to me, are evidence or markers of neoliberalism at work in the academy.
Thank you. Just want to stop for those of you who are with me and us. Feel free to ask any questions throughout, and so that we can continue to have this conversation.
Yeah, so I did want to just stop here after giving an overview of what Rosanna, Ruth Nicole, and I envisioned for the book. I know that was a lot of information about macro, meso, and micro level politics of inquiry, as well as the 5 ways that we were conceptualizing disruptive qualitative research. If there are any specific questions about that before we move on.
So there's a lot of terminologies, and I think every time I bring in when I'm talking about my own personal research and talk about disrupting traditional research, the 2 terms at the very least, like there's always a question about is disruption, and then what's traditional, right? And I think in your presentation, you mentioned traditional as something like the Creswell 5. And then disrupting, I think disrupting can have more of a variety of meaning. But if you were to, let's say, sum it up for those of us who are listening, what would be disrupting for you?
Well, I think that's a tough question because I think it is very contextual. The more that I teach classes and talk with doctoral students, especially ones that are not just in the College of Ed, but in journalism, communications, other fields and disciplines, we've discussed how there's not one definition of that. And I think that's why the 5, kind of the framework that Rosanna, Ruth, and I share is that these are 5 possible ways of disrupting. And oftentimes the authors in the book talked about how they didn't just draw upon one of those ways of disrupting, but multiple ways of disrupting. And so I think that disrupting is very contextual, as it does take into account what are the norms or standards or traditions within the field that you are working in. And so whether that's higher education or science education or math education, there would be, I think, different assumptions of what counts as traditional or dominant, and then different assumptions of what might count as something that fissures from that or moves away from that in some way. And I also think that over time, that definition changes, because as more people perhaps engage in disruptive work, perhaps some of that becomes the norm again. And so I think over time that disruption will happen and look different ways depending on the particularities of that time.
Thank you. And then there's another question about Panopticon.
Yeah. So Foucault talks about the concept of Panopticon, and I think a visual that helps me understand this term is thinking about a prison and having the guards of the prison who are in some kind of tower where they can watch the prisoners, but in such a way that the prisoners don't always know that they're being watched. And so the theory behind that is that the prisoners' behaviors would change in a way if they assume that they're always being watched, then they would, behave better, so to speak. And so I think that idea of Panopticon for ourselves as scholars, for ourselves, would be to think about this looming fear that we have always, that we're being watched or monitored, that there are certain ways that we feel we should be researchers, whether that's largely in the academy as a whole or at our particular institution. And so then we monitor ourselves, or we censor ourselves to behave in certain ways with the idea that we are constantly being watched or monitored for how we go about doing research.
And I think different institutions will look differently. As you mentioned, and you re-emphasized that in this institution, it's a research one institution. And so that means that they look at you as a faculty in regards to how much funding are you bringing in, for instance, the amounts of publications. And that's almost in parallel to the concept and the idea of neoliberalism. and how the neoliberal structure mechanism is what's forcing some institutions, some higher ed institutions, to establish certain requirements so that they meet certain deadlines, and so those requirements can be seen as these oversight that are put, that restrictions are put into faculty ourselves. We have one more question. I'm not sure if you want to.
Okay, what's the question?
So, given that qualitative only researchers are limited, how should emerging scholars who want to use it and ideally one day become experts in it like you, even though we are often pressured to use mixed methods approaches instead?
So the question is, what advice would I have for emerging scholars? Is that what it sounds like? I think the main thing that has been helpful for me is to seek networks and colleagues and peers who have similar ideas of ways they might go about doing research. And so that isn't always at the same institution that you're working at. It might be people that you meet at conferences, people whose work you read in journals, and you might seek them out to develop a relationship. And I think for me, it's been finding those people who we sometimes meet on a monthly basis virtually to just have conversations about what are you working through right now? What's going on at your institution? What feedback did you get from a journal reviewer? Different ways of problem solving together. And I think also there is something to be said about citational authority. And so finding scholars who have been able to publish that you can use as a way to, in a sense, support the work that you're trying to do, especially if it's in a journal that hasn't always been open to what you're proposing. So I think there's ways of navigating the politics of inquiry. It doesn't always work the way you want it to work, but I think trying to find communities and collectives that will support you in that work. There was something else that I was going to add to that, but it's left my thoughts right now. So it might come back to me.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. And I think your following slides can also give examples of different people who are doing this type of work.
Yeah, so the next few slides, I just wanted to show you some of the chapters in the book so that you can get a sense of, at least when the book was published in 2014, some of the ways that these authors were considering disruptive methodologies. And so you can see that on the first slide here, a lot of these approaches I would say are very artful. They use photography or embodied hip hop methodologies, multiple genres of poetry and personal narratives as a way to represent their work, but also as their methodology, how they went about analyzing and thinking about their work with materials and with people. And then the next group here, you can see from some of the titles that these scholars are thinking about. Perhaps the first one there, Sarah Childers, is pulling together feminist scholarship with post-structural, but also in a conversation around race and critical theories. So perhaps theories that don't often get woven together. You can see some of the others here are thinking about like crit walking, so critical theories and how that gets lived out, and very explicitly thinking about social justice in the local communities, more participatory methodologies that they used in local communities.
We have one more question, Dr. Kubi. How can we understand disrupting not as a violent disconnect from traditional, but as an ethical sensibility / acknowledgement of other traditional, quote unquote, traditional approaches? Yeah,
I mean, I like that question because we often, Ruth, Nicole, and Rosanna and I thought a lot about the word disruption can have a negative, violent connotation. And I don't think the three of us would say that that was our intention, but I think at the same time, we don't know of particular communities and perhaps what violence has been done to people in communities in the name of more traditional approaches. So I think, at least for me personally, there is a lot that I've, of course, learned from more traditional approaches. And I think it's not always about an either or. I think a lot of times there might be things within more traditional approaches that get questioned or assumptions that we might think differently about, that we weave with more disruptive approaches. So it could be a both and in some ways. So I think that question of violence is really important. And I think it's important because of the politics of inquiry and about how we position ourselves, how we write about our work, especially if we're seeking publication in particular journals, funding from particular agencies, thinking about how we weave our narratives in a way that we feel is true to ourselves as researchers, but also within the striated spaces of the academy. So I think that's a really smart thing to think about.
And that goes to also a previous question, where what do we do as novice researchers, and when we're trying to wrestle and bring in methodologies that will humanize or that will look differently at our data, our methodologies. And I think part of being violent is this notion of uncomfortableness, and how is it important to feel this sense, to be a bit uncomfortable. And I think that's part of thinking outside the box. I think that's part of the role of those individuals who are just doing things differently, are always seen as outcasts, or are always seen as the few out of the large group. And so I think part of violent can also, I mean, it could take different meanings. Right. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think about some of the chapters listed here, like the one by Cassie and Nicole. I mean, they talk about the tensions and responses they got from reviewers of journals and how they worked through that. We wanted an edited collection that weren't just the joyful victory narrative, so to speak. We wanted our authors to really wrestle with, that's why the subtitle is Tensions and Possibilities, because there's a lot of tensions that people encountered when they positioned their work perhaps in a way that went against the dominant or traditional ways of doing research in their particular fields. The next slide also, I think, speaks to that question, because the last 4 chapters of the book are really thinking about how do we live it out in the academy. And so Z's chapter, which is often one my doctoral students resonate with the most in the book, was about navigating the academy as a doctoral student. And so Z, who identifies as transgender, talks about what that's like in the academy, identities, and thinking about disruptive methodologies that Z was interested in, and what are the consequences of that? What are the roadblocks or the places where Z found renewal and hope and joy? And also the chapter by Hillary and Mark, that is a dialogue between Mark, who's the dissertation advisor, and Hillary, the student, when her institution did not allow her to publish a dissertation that was written as a teen magazine or in the format of a teen magazine. And so they dialogue back and forth about, you know, the institutional politics and how do you navigate that within higher ed. And so I think especially these last 4 chapters in the book, as all of them, are really thinking about what happens, the positive things, the things that might feel like setbacks, and how do you navigate that and move forward in really productive and hopeful ways.
Dr. Cooley, we have one more question, and it goes back to, the following question goes back to what's already being done, what scholars are already doing in the field. Like Dr. Stovall in Chicago, he's been doing this work for a while, and this question just gets to I guess to the point: is it disrupting methods in qualitative or innovating new methods in qualitative research?
It could be I guess it could be a both and. I think you can innovate methods that might not disrupt assumptions about what research is. I mean, if you think about like the Creswell 5, for instance, with grounded theory or narrative or ethnography, that there are innovations within those methodological traditions that might not be classified as disruptions necessarily. And so I think that, for me at least, I don't see the word innovation and disruption as synonyms, although I do think that many disruptive methodologies are innovative, if that makes sense. But I don't know that all innovations to methodologies might always be viewed as disruptions to epistemological and ontological viewpoints, disruptions to relationships with participants. So going back to those 5 ways that we define disruption in the edited book. I'm not sure that the arrow goes back and forth between innovation and disruption, always back and forth, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
Okay. So the next slide here is kind of a shift in the webinar. So the first part that we just spent time thinking about really was a focus on the edited book. And I would say, you know, that was published, I think, in 2014. And so since that time, I wanted to share a little bit about how I've continued to think about disruption within qualitative inquiry. So hold on one second. It's okay, you want to move it over?
So you can see, yeah.
Okay. There we go. Thanks, David. So for me, I've been reading more in what's called post-qualitative inquiry. And so in the 2010, I believe, Handbook of Qualitative Inquiry by SAGE, or Qualitative Research, St. Pierre had a chapter which she titled Post-Qualitative Inquiry. And for me, that's been the body of scholarship that I've been thinking about over the past few years. And so I think that it does build upon the edited collection. So I wanted to share a little bit about my thinking more recently about disruption. So you can see here that this quote that Elizabeth St. Pierre has, she claims that qualitative research has been so disciplined, so normalized, so centered, especially because of recent assaults by scientifically based research, that it has become conventional, reductionist, hegemonic, and sometimes oppressive, and has lost its radical possibilities to produce different knowledge and to produce knowledge differently. And I feel like that's a really bold statement that she makes, and I could see be read very controversial. I think what I've learned from reading from St. Pierre's work is that she claims that we've forgotten we've made it all up. That at some point in time, humans made up qualitative research in a particular context in a particular time. And that if we just stick to the ways it's always been done for decades, then perhaps that is, maybe using that word violence, perhaps that, you know, is not the best thing for the communities that we're working with today. And that we have to be open to changing, rethinking, exploring. And so St. Pierre also talks about that many of the books and the articles that are produced around qualitative research really are how-to books, you know, how to code, step-by-step methodologies. And she claims that they lack really deep theory or philosophical assumptions about knowing and being and doing in the world. So I think for me right now, I'm personally rethinking myself, you know, what is qualitative research? What are the norms? Whether those are norms for data production, for analysis, for the ways we write up our research, and thinking about those norms and questioning them and wondering why is that the only way that research can be done.
And Dr. Kubi, real quickly, if you don't mind, we have a question that goes back to what you are highlighting in this quote. The question is, would you mind commenting a bit more about hip-hop methodologies and how this informs your work? And I think it goes to thinking differently, right? Yeah.
Well, the particular chapters in the edited book that are related to that is specifically Ruth Nicole Brown's work. She has been working in a group called Soul Hot, which are African-American youth in her community. And so a lot of the work that she does with those youth is collectively creating hip hop and performing that in different venues, different spaces. And so when I've been with Ruth Nicole and seen her present with these young women, I think, you know, she would have to speak better about the way she methodologically goes about doing that work. But the question about how it informs my work, I would say that it has opened up or allowed me to think otherwise, to think about other possibilities of how we work with communities and how we represent our work in very embodied ways with the communities that we are researching with. And so I think it's been very inspiring for me to see how she co-researches, co-writes, co-performs with these young women in communities that are very local, but also even at national, you know, conferences and speaking engagements within the Academy.
Thank you.
So I found it helpful to really try to research the history of qual research. How did we get where we are now? And I think thinking historically about kind of where qual research started and came from and where we are today has helped me to think about what it might mean to disrupt. By no means did qual research start in the 1980s, the way it says here. It definitely was going on way before that. But I think just in a more recent context, St. Pierre talks about her time as a scholar. And so she did her PhD work in the 90s. And so she talks about how during that time frame, there was a lot of people using post theories to critique or deconstruct conventional humanist methodologies. And then this connects to some of the things we wrote about in the Disruptive book, that in the 2000s, the National Research Council's report, I think for many scholars really influenced or impacted what was valued at their institutions or what gets valued in a journal. And she really saw this as a shift in how qualitative research is conducted. She talks a little bit about, how qual research became more positivist in the sense that while we might interview people, we would plug that data in to count for themes and to reduce it to numbers in many ways that didn't get at the complexity of the lived experiences of the people. And so she connects this back to what was happening on a national and federal level. And then from 2010 now, there is a group of scholars who are using this term post-qualitative, and they mean that in two different ways. One is many of them are using post-theories, so postmodern, post-structural, post-colonial, post-human. But also the post is to signal after more conventional dominant approaches to qualitative research and how they are specifically trying to think about ontology. So that would be thinking about reality and the world coming to be, when often educational research focuses on epistemology and knowing as if it is separate from our being and lived realities of the world. And so that's really, I think for me, an exciting body of scholarship that is calling into question the ways we've done research and why, and also helping us think about epistemology, ontology, and axiology together, and how those can't be separate. And if they're not, how does that change our research approaches, our methodologies, and our methods?
That's, if you don't mind me interrupting for a second, that's another question that when I'm presenting my own research, and I bring in concepts like epistemology, ontology, and axiology, not everybody has had a clear understanding or a working understanding of those terms. Would you mind sharing a little bit about those three terms and how important it is in doing this type of work?
Sure. So I think epistemology is the one most people are most familiar with. I think it has dominated educational research. It focuses on how we come to know, thinking about knowledge, meaning making, thinking about perhaps teaching and learning. And so, I mean, that is a focus on what someone knows and how they come to know. Ontology, the way I understand it, is it's a focus on being, the being in the world. So thinking about reality or multiple realities. And so I think often when we think about, for example, classroom research in a school maybe, we often are looking at what students know and how they know that and how we can measure that, how we can assess that. But at the same time that we look at the teaching practices in that classroom, we have to also think about what do those practices produce? What realities get created in that space? And so I think that shift of not just looking for meaning making and how knowledge is constructed, but also what gets produced in the interactions in that space is really important to consider. And that connects to axiology and thinking about the ethics, the relational ethics of the research that we do. And those relationships and how we view communities or participants, how we think about ethics and what is considered ethical for yourself as a researcher shapes the way that you interact in your research spaces and research communities, which in part also shapes the realities that are getting produced as you're interacting with participants and communities. And it also shapes what knowledge is being produced in those spaces. And so it really does see that those three philosophical concepts can't be pulled apart, that they are intricately woven together. and that it does matter as researchers that we think about how we are very much a part of the research entanglement that we're a part of in the communities that we work with.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So for me, as I've been reading this body of scholarship over the past few years, I've tried to think about, in preparation for today, what has this body called post-qualitative inquiry changed for me? I think one thing which does connect to the disruptive book is I still think I'm a firm believer about reading theories alongside or with one another that might not always be seen as going together. So sometimes in the academy, there are very particular viewpoints on which theories work together and which ones don't. And for me, I found it to be really fruitful and energizing and productive to try to read theories with and against one another that perhaps are not always seen as compatible, and to use that tension or the rub between those as productive spaces about thinking in new and different ways. This body of scholarship for me has also, specifically in work around post-human or more than human ways of knowing, has made me question the way that I think about voice and the way I think about a human focus of research, and how voice is often seen as like pure. So for example, in an interview, we type up a transcript and we treat that transcript as if it is this pure reflection of reality in some way. And so it's really caused me to think about, what does that produce for the people that I'm researching with? And what might be other ways of thinking about voice and representation, and also the non-humans and more than human bodies that are in a research space. So for me, researching in a classroom at a school, there's much more than the teacher and student there. There are desks, there are papers, there are pencils, there are books, there are iPads, there are fans, there are all these different materials in the classroom that shape how learning happens and shapes what realities are getting produced in the classroom. So I've been trying to think about, what does that look like? How do I represent that in my research? The third one is connected to what we were just talking about with David's question, but really thinking about how do I practically go about researching with the acknowledgement that ethics, ontology, and epistemology are all connected together. This body of scholarship, again, has helped me to think in my research questions to really focus on what's being produced in a community or in a classroom, not solely focusing on, what meaning gets made by a particular lesson or teaching strategy, but what's getting produced in the relationships. And so all of that has had me question or think about, what might need to change in my research practices. How do I think about data now? What is the field? Who are the participants? Are there human and non-human participants? How do you go about transcribing and representing that? And so these are not that I have answers to any of these five, but that these are the things that I am currently wrestling with and thinking about right now.
Thank you. Dr. Kui, we have one question, and this says, how is disruptive research methods different in qualitative research when research on communities of color continue to be non-disruptive in mainstream educational research? So if findings in research on communities of color don't disrupt the practices and realities within institutions, how will disruptive methods provide a different lens? Really good question.
Okay, so let me see if I'm understanding the question right. So what I'm hearing is that when research on communities of colors continue to be non-disruptive in mainstream educational research, if the findings of research on communities of colors don't disrupt the practices and realities within institutions, how will disruptive methods provide a different lens?
So it's almost, for me, it's thinking about how to, and please feel free to, who asked this question? Let's see. This was by Lisa Bang.
Okay.
So Lisa, feel free to clarify. But what I'm seeing it is, I myself, for my dissertation, I'm looking at how do Black families disrupt, I guess, in a way, policies in their local communities. And so for me is, how do I bring this ivory tower information down to a space where some communities of color continue to struggle? And will my methodology, such as what I've constructed for my dissertation, which is post-colonial in a way, will that actually impact the policies that the families are trying to combat?
Yeah. So I think that's what you mean. Does it actually disrupt the institution,
Right.
right? And the realities and the practices. I don't know of an answer for that other than to say, I think when I think of people whose work seems to have spoke to that the most, they seem to really work in harmony with the communities they're working with. And I think having those conversations with the communities about what changes do they want? What would that change look like? Who are the people that we need to speak to about that? How might we go about getting the word out about our work? What are the things that we're demanding or wanting to change? And I think that scholars that I've talked to who would say that their work is really focused on communities of color is that there's this tension, I think, for them in the academy of how do I keep my job and how do I, maintain, if that's a choice for me to stay in the academy, how do I do that at the same time of honoring, the work, so to speak, in those communities and working with those people in very, what might often be seen as very vulnerable situations. And so I think that's a constant lived tension. I think it's about finding spaces in the academy to share those stories. So for example, I know in October here at Mizzou, they have a Black Studies conference that are over the course of 2 days. And I think finding ways within the institution to not just have the academics share their stories, but also to have the communities that they work with here to share those stories is one way to disrupt the institution. I think of Ruth Nicole's work with Soul Hot and the hip hop ethnographies and the different spaces that they do those in are not just the local community center, so to speak, but they really, go to different campuses and academies and conferences to disrupt that space of the institution. So I think it's finding those creative ways within the institution as well as outside of the institution to make it more fluid in between those communities. And how you choose to spend your time, your efforts, your energies, your publications, et cetera. So.
And I believe it'll look different for each faculty, for each individual. And I think that's the task when you're choosing to do post-qualitative work or anything work, is that you're choosing to challenge not only the powers that be in the institution, but also so at the ivory tower level in higher education, your department, the way journals are published. Not only are you willingly choosing to disrupt that or challenge that, but also you're going to the communities and working with the communities and figuring out, okay, how do I work with this community to challenge and disrupt the powers that be? So it's a parallel, simultaneous work that needs to happen. And it's an ongoing work.
Yeah, and I think it's also important for newer scholars that are maybe finishing a doctoral program and looking for jobs is that it should not be all on your back, so to speak. I think that at the institution of higher ed, that your associate faculty members or full professors who are committed to disruptive projects, let's say, are doing work to question what counts as tenure or promotion, to question, what gets valued within that department, and to be able to advocate and to speak up. So I think finding mentors within the institution, even if it's not in your direct department, but to find ones that help you learn how to navigate the institutional space in a way that is, savvy and resists at the same time of, being a part of that institution. And
right.
I think that's really helpful, is to find people who are already doing this kind of work at an institution.
And when I say that it looks different, I know faculty here at Mizzou who their work is, for instance, in counseling psychology. I'm thinking about Lisa Flores. In a way, Dr. Lisa Flores, her work has mainly focused on multiculturalism, and some people would argue whether that's disruptive or not. But it's a way we all have to find something that fits for us, right? I think at the end of the day, and personally, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but personally, we cannot be judgmental. We all have our own personal individual values and our own politics. We can only do so much individually. But when we choose to do something, again, I'm thinking about yourself, for instance, in your own work and doing work in early childhood, you choose to do it in a way that works for you and disrupts the field. So looking at elementary classroom and looking at the posthumanist aspect of it.
Right. Absolutely.
So
I hope that helps some, Lisa.
Yeah, let's see. Did she clarify? No.
I think so. Okay. So I was going to share just a few examples from my work as we wrap up today, more recent work. Oh, and it's not showing up on that one. Well, I'll just talk a little bit about it. So more recently, I co-authored a book with a classroom teacher that I've been working with since 2010. And like David was just saying, for me, what looks disruptive for me as an early childhood literacy scholar is questioning what counts as literacy. What do we define as writing? What tools, non-human aspects of the classroom come into play as children compose? And so in the book here, we really wrestled with how do we represent on paper a transcript that doesn't privilege the human, but also takes into account space, time, matter, and materials. And so we played around with, within the limits of the publishing world, it still had to be two-dimensional and on paper, but played around with different fonts, different alignments on the page, using different icons and the use of different kinds of punctuation. And so for us, that was one way to disrupt what counts as academic writing, what counts as a transcript that honored the theoretical commitments that we were drawing upon in the book. And I think the next slide won't show it either, so let's skip to the one after that. And so in the book as well, we played around with what counts in an academic text. And so we wrote a chapter around nonfiction writing in this classroom. And instead of just telling the readers about the nonfiction projects in her classroom, we invited readers to play a game, to invite them to actually interact with the book, which was in alignment with the theoretical arguments that we were making in the book about humans and non-humans interacting. Another example is thinking about journal articles. Oh, they're not going to show up for them. So I'll talk a little bit since it's not showing up on the PowerPoint necessarily. If you go forward, let's see if any of them actually pop up. No. Okay, well, I'll just talk through the last. And some of the other pieces that I've written, I've played around with using poetry, thinking about writing poetry from different perspectives of the participants that I've worked with. Thought about using different fonts to represent different theoretical ideas. Some other examples is trying to kind of break the traditional sections of an article. And so instead of having to have like a rationale, a lit review, a theory or theoretical framework, a method section, findings and conclusion or discussion and implications, you're trying to break how it's written when the theories that I'm drawing upon kind of resist that theory and methods aren't connected in some way. So I think all of that to say, I encourage you to think about the ways that we represent speaks to our beliefs about knowledge and ontology, realities, and our relationships with our participants. And so being experimental or playful in how we think about representing is one way, not the only way, but it's one way to try to disrupt within the institution, within academic publishing. So any questions before, I just have one more slide, I think, or two, but I was paused to see if there's any questions about what we've been talking about regarding post-qualitative. Not at this point?
Not at this point.
Okay. Well, so the last, second to last slide, this kind of answers or at least gives you some things to think about with a question that got asked earlier in the webinar. How do you get started thinking about perhaps post-qualitative or even, disruptive practices, however you define those? One thing I would say is study philosophy. And the reason I think that is because there's a lot of assumptions about knowledge, about reality, about truth, about relationships that should precede methodological conversations. And I think that at least more recently in the academy, at least for me in educational scholarship, there seems to be less readings and conversations about different ways of knowing and being and doing in the world, and how that shapes what we do methodologically. I won't read through all of these because I want to leave a little time if there's some more questions, but I think the third one is to just continue to read and read and read more, even if you don't understand it. I try to tell my students to give them permission to not understand. If you don't understand a paragraph, skip it and go on, come back to that same piece several years later, and you might be surprised at what makes sense then to you, but to just keep reading and don't get frustrated if it feels like it doesn't make sense to you. I also try to encourage my students to approach analysis as thinking, not coding. What happens when you read a particular body of literature in conversation with your data? How might that open up new possibilities and new ideas that coding or classifying or sorting might reduce those complexities? And so really tell them to just think and then jot down how you were thinking, and that becomes your methods. You don't have to go choose a method that somebody's already done, because analysis, at least for me, is about thinking. And that doesn't look the same for two individuals. Also, I think leaning into stuckness is important. I think often that feeling of not knowing or uncomfortableness that David was talking about earlier, we can try to shy away from it and try to fix it. But I think that doing disruptive work, or if we want to say, innovative work, like we mentioned earlier, can feel very uncomfortable. And I think surrounding yourself with people who help you with that stuckness is really important. So I think I'll end with the very last slide here, and then we can just do, if there's any final questions. There's a quote here that St. Pierre uses, but it's from Foucault. And Foucault says, for Foucault, the new is not at all what is in fashion, but rather what we cannot yet see or say in what is happening in us, just because it is not already contained in the given structures that govern what we can think. We can't see the new because we're limited by the structures of the present, and we have no language yet to say it. Pre-existing structures normalize our thinking and produce minds in a groove, but experimentation can help us move out of the grooves of the normal and the self-evident. So I'll end with that call, or that invitation, that encouragement for you to think about how to not continue to perpetuate maybe minds in the groove.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we have a couple of minutes left, 3 to be exact. We have one more question. Thank you for your response. The 5 reasons for the book at the beginning of the book are common ethics and values that are embedded in many scholars of color, myself included. I just think it's hard to disrupt methods when the landscape of research is hard to shake or not easily disrupt.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the 5 ways that we defined it were not necessarily new. I think we were trying to pull those together in one space. And I think you're right. I think it's really hard. And I think for me, it's about maybe finding, it might be small things that disrupt, but that over time produce larger changes. And so for me, it's been trying to find small ways within the institution that over time, hopefully, produce larger changes. I don't think it's always like one thing will make this huge change necessarily. I think a lot of it goes back to that notion of ontology, that our being in the academy, our doing in the academy, the relationships that we have in the academy, if we're intentional in those relationships and ways of being, then hopefully over time that is producing, new ways of knowing, new ways of knowledge production within the academy. And so I think that's again where I see that ethics and the ontology and epistemology all threaded and connected together in creating disruption or in creating change.
Thank you. We're right on time. I actually want to give a quick second if anyone else has another question. And as you think about the question, I want to encourage you to pass this on to any of your classmates. This will be on our website, UCEA website, and we'll be sending you a link to that. Also, we'll have the PowerPoint available, as well as the handout that we provided today. Dr. Candace Kubi, we can provide her information, and you can get in touch with her. Again, this is something that I was introduced to 3 or 4 years ago, and it fits with my type of work. And so I encourage you to, if you have any type of interest, I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Candace Kubi, reach out to myself, David Aguayo, and let's have a conversation. Let's start a network, serious network, because this is something that we need to continue to talk about. Any other questions? Let me see as I talk. Have you looked at institutional entrepreneurship literature? I see many parallels between the call to disrupt in both areas. Perhaps there might be help for those educational scholars seeking to disrupt that literature.
Yeah.
And some of us are driven by this kind of research, but we are concerned about producing dissertations that are due to neoliberalism, do not demonstrate money-making measures. How can this be countered in a dissertation?
Well, that's a really actually big question. I think as I worked with students in doctoral committee work, I think that you have to decide that one is the dissertation is not your life work. It is a piece of your work for your career. And so I think you have to think about your particular context and what for you is a non-negotiable and what might you be willing to let go of or table in order to navigate the politics of that particular institution that's granting your PhD. And so I think that, there's not one answer for that. I think that you have to have a lot of conversations, try to find people to be on your committee and mentors. Maybe it's an outside committee member from another institution that's a part of your committee that can speak up to some of the ideas or desires that you have for your dissertation. But I also to think about how it's one piece of your work as a scholar, but that you would have many more years after that to perhaps disrupt in a different way that you found wasn't, you weren't able to do with your dissertation. So again, I think it's the small steps maybe sometimes. What are some small ways to disrupt? It might not be all the ways that you want to disrupt. So.
And I agree, my dissertation is post-qualitative, and it was very much thanks to my committee who allowed me to pursue that type of work. I thank everyone. Dr. Kubi, thank you for coming in and sharing your experience, your work with us. We're going to finalize this webinar. Again, this will be posted later on our website, UCEA's website, and we'll see you next next month for the next part of the series. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kubi.
Thank you. Thanks so much.